Far below the world of sunlight, the Greeks imagined a depth so terrible that even the dead feared its name, Tartarus. This was not merely darkness, but a place older than kingdoms, older than memory, older than the trembling rule of gods. Ancient poets spoke of it as the deepest wound in creation, hidden beneath earth, storm, and the roots of existence. In the earliest myths, Tartarus was not just a place of punishment, but a primal force woven into the structure of the cosmos. Before empires, before temples, before men raised songs to Olympus, to the Greek mind, the universe had layers, and beneath all familiar things there waited an inverted world of fear. Later generations would call it a prison, a pit, a hell, but its oldest meaning was deeper and stranger than all of those. Tartarus belonged to that first age when myth explained distance, terror, order, and the fragile boundary between rule and rebellion. Even the gods did not speak of it lightly, because Tartarus represented the fate reserved for enemies of divine law.
And so our story begins not in a city of stone, but in a mythic abyss that ancient voices of...
In some traditions, Tartarus was personified, a primordial presence born at the beginning of all things. He was less a human-shaped god than the living body of the abyss itself, vast, mute, and impossible to escape. The old cosmology imagined heaven above and Tartarus below, two opposite vaults enclosing the world between them. Earth rested like a disk between these extremes, while mankind lived in the narrow middle, never far from terror.
Where Olympus symbolized order, light, and kingship, Tartarus stood for confinement.
It was the underside of creation, the place where power was buried when it became too dangerous for the upper world.
The earliest poets described it with bronze thresholds, iron gates, and a darkness thick with wind and storm.
It was not empty silence, but a pressure-filled realm, where ancient forces were sealed behind divine barriers. There, distance became punishment, and depth itself was transformed into law by the hand of Zeus. But long before Zeus ruled, Tartarus already existed, as a warning hidden within the architecture of myth. Before the Olympians, the sky god Uranus ruled, and fear already shaped the destiny of those born beneath him.
Uranus hated the monstrous children of Earth and pushed some of them down into the hidden depths below.
Among these were the Cyclopes and the hundred-handed Hecatoncheires, beings of raw force and ancient terror.
The myth remembers their confinement as one of the first great injustices written into the world.
Earth groaned under that cruelty, and resentment gathered like thunder beneath the surface of creation. In this way, Tartarus first appears as a place where rulers bury what they cannot control. It becomes the shadow of kingship itself, the secret cellar of power, where fear is locked away but never removed.
The imprisoned children did not vanish from myth. They remained waiting in darkness, remembered by Earth.
The lesson was simple and terrible. What is cast down does not cease to exist, it only deepens. From that buried resentment would rise the next upheaval in the divine family, and with it, a new ruler.
Kronos took power, and for a moment the old tyranny seemed broken, yet the abyss remained open beneath the world. The new king feared threats just as deeply, and the memory of Tartarus continued to govern divine decisions. Even in victory, the Titans inherited a universe built on confinement, prophecy, and the dread of replacement. Myth never presents power as secure. Every throne stands above a darkness filled with enemies and omens. Kronos knew too well that a son might rise against a father, because he himself had done exactly that.
So the age of the Titans was never peaceful radiance, but a tense interval between one cosmic violence and another.
Below them, Tartarus endured like a sealed archive of unfinished danger. It waited through each reign, unchanged in purpose, receiving what the ruling order most feared.
The abyss was not political in the human sense, yet every divine regime used it as the final answer to rebellion.
That is why Tartarus matters so much in Greek myth. It is where power hides its nightmares. That is why Tartarus matters so much in Greek myth. It is where power hides its nightmares.
Rhea saved her youngest son, Zeus, and concealed him until the time for open challenge arrived.
With Zeus grew the promise that the buried order of the cosmos would be torn apart once more. When he forced Kronos to release his swallowed children, the old succession war returned with greater fury.
This conflict would become the Titanomachy, the war that decided whether Olympus or the Titans would rule.
But victory required more than courage. It required opening the prison that earlier kings had kept shut. Zeus descended into the memory of old injustice and released the Cyclopes from their confinement. He also freed the 100-handed Hecatoncheires, whose strength would become decisive in the coming struggle.
From the Cyclopes came gifts of thunder, lightning, and the weapons that turned Zeus into the Storm King.
The war that followed shook heaven, earth, and sea with an almost apocalyptic violence. In these stories, cosmic battle is never clean. Mountains burn, oceans tremble, and the air itself becomes hostile. Defeat did not mean simple death, because primordial enemies in Greek myth are too vast to disappear so easily. Instead, the conquered Titans were hurled into Tartarus, deeper than any mortal realm and farther than grief. There they were locked behind bronze gates, under the earth, beyond the borders of ordinary death. The Hecatoncheires became their guards, an ironic reversal of the earlier injustice once done to them. Thus Tartarus became the great prison of divine history, holding the defeated age beneath the victorious one. It was not merely a dungeon, but a monument to Zeus's claim that order had finally overcome chaos.
Yet the prison also revealed something uneasy in that order. Olympus needed chains, gates, and watchers to remain secure. The Titanomachy ended above, but its fear survived below in the sealed darkness of Tartarus. The abyss now contained not potential rebels, but the memory of an entire fallen regime. In Greek imagination, the past was never gone. It was buried alive beneath the present. Poets describe Tartarus with bronze walls and iron doors, materials that suggest divine engineering rather than natural cave. These images gave shape to fear, turning abstract distance into architecture that listeners could almost see. The gates implied no ordinary jailer, but a prison built to contain beings older than thunder and sea. Winds roared there, darkness thickened there, and the atmosphere itself seemed hostile to hope. Some accounts imagine the threshold as a place where night and day passed one another at the edge of the abyss. This made Tartarus part of a vast cosmic geography, rather than a detached chamber of torment. It belonged to the same universe as stars and seasons, but occupied its most dreaded depth. The Greeks did not always separate religion, poetry, and cosmology. In Tartarus, all three become one vision. It is prison, principle, and landscape at the same time, impossible to reduce to a single modern category. That complexity is why Tartarus continued to change in meaning across centuries, without ever losing its darkness. The danger of Tartarus was not little to those thrown into it, because myth also linked it to monstrous birth. With Earth, Tartarus was said in some traditions to father Typhon, the great serpentine enemy of Zeus. Typhon embodied everything the Olympian order feared: chaos, storm, revolt, and unconquerable scale. When he rose against Zeus, the sky itself seemed vulnerable. as though the old abyss were striking upward. The battle between Zeus and Typhon became another test of whether cosmic rule could survive primal violence.
Lightning met monstrous fire, mountains shattered, and the world once again hovered near collapse.
Zeus prevailed, and Typhon too was cast down into the deep, sealed away beneath divine force. This repeated pattern matters. Tartarus is both the source of cosmic threat and the place where threat is buried. It is therefore not only an ending, but a recurring origin of fear within Greek myth.
The abyss produces rebellion. Rebellion is crushed, and the defeated are returned to the abyss.
Over time, Tartarus changed from a prison for divine enemies into a realm associated with the punishment of the wicked dead. This was not an abrupt replacement, but an expansion of meaning across poetry, philosophy, and popular imagination. Once the abyss held titans, later it also held mortals whose crimes offended gods, kinship, or sacred law.
In this later vision, Tartarus became the dark opposite of Elysium, where blessed souls might find peace.
The underworld was no longer one uniform destination. Fate after death reflected the moral weight of a life. That development allowed Greek storytellers to transform cosmic terror into ethical warning.
Tartarus now taught listeners that some acts carried consequences deeper than ordinary death. Hospitality betrayed, kin murdered, hubris displayed, and oaths broken could lead the soul downward.
The punishments were not random spectacles, but symbolic reflections of each sinner's offense. This made the abyss legible in a new way, not just as prison, but as meaning made visible through torment. In philosophical and later mythic tradition, souls were not simply dropped into darkness without measure or distinction.
Judges such as Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus were imagined to weigh the deeds of the dead. Their presence introduced procedure into the underworld, giving divine punishment the shape of law. Not every soul entered Tartarus, and not every offense earned endless torment.
Some were said to suffer for correction, while others served as eternal examples for the living.
This distinction reflects a sophisticated moral imagination, rather than pure horror for its own sake.
Tartarus was terrible, but it was not meaningless. Its terror communicated judgment and proportion.
Ancient audiences heard in these stories a warning that status, cleverness, or power could not bribe death. In the end, kings, tricksters, and oathbreakers might all face the same dark tribunal. That idea helped Tartarus endure not only in religion, but in ethics, literature, and drama. Among the most famous souls bound to Tartarus was Sisyphus, king, deceiver, and master of futile cunning.
He betrayed divine secrets, defied the natural order, and even tried to outwit death itself.
For such arrogance, he was condemned to push a massive stone uphill forever. Each time the summit neared, the boulder slipped from his grasp and thundered back into the darkness. The punishment was perfect in its symbolism: endless labor without completion, effort without triumph, will without reward.
Sisyphus had trusted intelligence without reverence, and his sentence turned cleverness into exhaustion.
Ancient storytellers understood the horror of repetition long before modern philosophy gave it a language.
In Tartarus, there is no climax, only recurrence, and Sisyphus became its clearest emblem. His torment is almost mechanical, but that cold regularity makes it even more haunting. The stone falls because the sentence itself is the true mountain, and no strength can conquer it. Another great figure of punishment was Tantalus, whose crime poisoned the sacred bond between mortals and gods. In different traditions, his offenses vary, but all involve betrayal, arrogance, or a violation of divine trust. He was placed in water beneath fruiting branches, always near relief, and forever denied it. When he bent to drink, the water withdrew. When he reached upward, the fruit lifted beyond his hands.
Need remained constant, while satisfaction retreated at the final instant.
His suffering gave later languages the word tantalize, but the original myth is far darker than the modern echo. Tantalus is punished not by physical destruction, but by nearness without fulfillment. The cruelty lies in proximity, in desire sharpened by visibility and frustrated by design. Here too, Tartarus reveals its symbolic precision. Punishment becomes the shape of the crime made permanent.
A man who crossed limits finds himself trapped inside limit itself.
Fiction's story joined murder, ingratitude, and desire into one of Tartarus's most unforgettable punishments.
After grave offenses, he was granted hospitality by Zeus himself, an act of mercy almost beyond deserving.
Yet even there, Ixion reached toward Hera and repaid divine grace with lust and betrayal. For this he was bound to a blazing wheel, spinning without end through the darkness. The image is violent, but its power comes from motion that never resolves into escape. Ixion becomes a creature of circular punishment, trapped in an eternal return of his own corruption. The wheel suggests both cosmic order and its perversion, turning forever with no redemptive direction. To offend a host was serious enough. To violate the trust of Zeus made the crime nearly absolute.
Tartarus answers that offense with a punishment as public and memorable as the transgression itself.
In this way, myth teaches through images too strong to forget.
The daughters of Danus, remembered as the Danaids, were also numbered among the punished dead in later tradition. Having murdered their husbands on their wedding night, they carried into death a stain no ritual could erase.
In Tartarus, they were made to fill a vessel or basin that could never hold water. The labor was endless because the container itself defeated completion. Like Sisyphus, they serve as an image of futility, but here the burden is collective and mournful. Their punishment feels less explosive than Ixion's, yet no less merciless in its design. It turns domestic betrayal into endless labor performed in silence, beneath the world. The leaking vessel is more than an object. It is a metaphor for broken union and irreparable deed. Through the Danaids, Tartarus becomes a gallery of crimes, translated into visible symbols. Each sentence tells a story without needing explanation from a judge on screen.
Ancient tradition placed other offenders in Tartarus as well, each carrying a sentence fitted to a remembered crime. Ocnus was imagined weaving a rope that a donkey consumed as fast as he made it. Phlegyas, who dishonored Apollo, was pictured tormented beneath the warning shadow of divine retribution. These names are less famous today, but together they expand the underworld into a structured realm of examples. Tartarus did not need one central villain. It displayed a pattern of consequence across many lives. Some suffered for violence against kin, others for impiety, deceit, or contempt toward the gods. Variety mattered because it turned myth into a moral map for the living world above.
Listeners could hear these stories and locate danger in their own behavior, ambition, or pride.
In that sense, Tartarus functioned as memory, law, and theater all at once. It frightened, but it also clarified, marking where boundaries had been crossed beyond repair. When philosophers spoke of Tartarus, they often treated myth not as childish fantasy, but as moral language. The abyss became a way to think about justice, correction, and the fate of souls after death. In some accounts, punishment could cleanse those whose crimes were not utterly beyond remedy.
Others, however, were presented as incurable, condemned forever as warnings to the living. This distinction reveals an underworld with purpose, rather than chaos for its own sake.
Tartarus becomes a place where the structure of justice is dramatized through unforgettable imagery.
Even those who doubted literal details could still use the myth to express truth about consequence. A soul may evade human law, but not the deeper reckoning imagined beneath the world.
That idea gave Tartarus power far beyond religion alone. It entered ethics, rhetoric, and imagination. In later literature, echoes of the abyss continued to shape how the West pictured punishment and descent. To imagine Tartarus fully, one must feel not only pain, but scale, distance, and the pressure of ancient time. It is a place of bronze, smoke, underground wind, and a darkness that seems older than death. The air does not soothe. It waits, grinds, and reminds every captive how far the light has vanished.
No sunrise reaches this depth, and no ordinary season can change its condition.
Above, kings rise and temples fall, but beneath, the same punishments continue without interruption. This timelessness is part of the horror, because nothing in Tartarus moves toward healing or conclusion. The stories emphasize repetition, enclosure, and failed desire more than bloodshed.
That restraint makes the abyss more haunting, not less, because the mind supplies what the poet withholds.
Tartarus is not chaos in motion, but consequence frozen into eternal process. It is the place where myth slows down and refuses the mercy of ending. Tartarus endured because it answered many needs at once: cosmic explanation, political memory, and moral warning.
It explained where defeated divine powers went when the new order of gods claimed victory.
It warned rulers that power always rests above an underlayer of suppressed violence. It warned mortals that hidden crimes might still meet visible consequence after death.
It offered poets grand images, philosophers moral frameworks, and audiences unforgettable scenes of judgment. Unlike a simple hell, Tartarus carried the memory of the universe before stability, before Olympus, before law.
Yes. That ancient depth gave every later punishment a larger and darker backdrop.
To descend there in story was to move backward through layers of history, as much as downward through space. The punished soul entered a place where the ruins of cosmic war still echoed beneath the sentence. That is why even its later moral function never erased its primordial identity. So the dark historia of Tartarus is not the history of a city, but of the darkest chamber in Greek imagination.
It begins with creation itself, descends through rebellion and divine war, and ends in judgments that outlive empires.
There the Titans remain, as shadows of a defeated age, sealed beneath the rule of Zeus.
There Sisyphus strains, Tantalus reach, Ixion turns, and the Danaids labor without completion. Each figure speaks a different language of punishment, but all belong to the same abyss of consequence.
Tartarus reminds us that the Greeks pictured evil not only as pain, but as distance, repetition, and irretrievable loss.
It is the underworld beneath the underworld, the depth beneath death, the prison beneath memory.
And because of that, its image still survives, long after the temples that first named it fell silent.